Last week, we published our review of the OnePlus 15. In it, I criticized the phone for a bunch of reasons, but a big one was that it couldn't complete a standard stress testing benchmark without overheating. You can see that it shuts down during the benchmark and hits an exterior temperature of 127 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 52 degrees Celsius. Keep in mind that that's the outside temperature. The chipset itself is much, much hotter than that. So what I didn't mention in that video is that other phones with the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 are facing similar problems. The two other phones we've tested made it through the whole benchmark without shutting down, unlike the OnePlus 15, but they were both very, very hot. The realme GT8 Pro hit a peak internal temp of 111 degrees Fahrenheit, or 44.1 degrees Celsius. To do that though, it needed to drastically throttle performance with just 33% stability. Meanwhile, Nubia's REDMAGIC 11 Pro also got really hot with a peak internal temp of 131 degrees Fahrenheit, or 55 degrees Celsius. However, it still made it through the entire benchmark with a very strong 80% stability. This is likely thanks to the fact that it literally has a liquid cooler built into it with fan assistance. All this data points to one thing, which is that to see the peak gaming performance you expect of something like the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5, you're going to need to deal with excessive amounts of heat or a large amount of throttling. Given that the processor is still very new and we have yet to see some of the biggest launches with it, particularly the Galaxy S26 series, I thought it would be good to talk about what we've seen so far, what we might see going forward, and what this means not just for these phones, but for the entire Android smartphone industry. Let's look at the trajectory of the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5. At Snapdragon Summit this year, Qualcomm gave creators and journalists access to a reference device for benchmarking. This reference phone was designed by Qualcomm for one specific purpose, which is to run benchmarks. I was at that event and ran various benchmarks, including the Wildlife Extreme stress test on the reference unit. It finished the whole test, and when it was done, the reference phone was pretty toasty. Not super hot, but definitely something I wouldn't want to hold in my hand for very long. At the time, this was not surprising to me. For these sessions, Qualcomm's number one concern is that we walk out of that room with benchmark numbers that are very, very high and back up the claims they'll make when they announce the chip. That's exactly what happened, and you can hear more about my experience with this by checking out this video up here. So fast forward a bit from that event, and we got our hands on the very first retail phone with a Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5, which was the Nubia REDMAGIC 11 Pro. The one with the liquid cooling included. We ran our suite of benchmarks and we found that the phone performed very well. Much better than all Android competitors at the time, and it even managed to clobber the A19 Pro inside the Apple iPhone 17 Pro, at least when it comes to CPU multi-core performance. However, we also found that the performance of this retail phone didn't come close to the reference phone Qualcomm gave us at Snapdragon Summit. Depending on the test, it performed anywhere between 3% and 8% slower than the reference device. This wasn't totally unexpected, as the Qualcomm phone only exists to do benchmarks, while the REDMAGIC 11 Pro is meant to do all the things a real phone needs to do. Still, an 8% disparity is quite a lot. We did notice that the REDMAGIC 11 Pro got pretty hot during these tests too, but we also were well aware that the advanced cooling system would make any conclusions about heat based on this one phone pretty much irrelevant. But then we got our next phone, which was the realme GT8 Pro. As mentioned earlier, this phone also completed all our benchmarks, even the Wildlife Extreme stress test. However, its numbers were even weaker than the REDMAGIC's. Finally, we got the OnePlus 15. For typical benchmarking tests, it performed with flying colors. But for stress tests where the phone really gets truly pushed to its limits, it fails. It simply will not complete the test due to overheating. You can see how this data ramped up. We've got 3 retail phones and 1 reference model, and they all tell the same story. To get the performance advertised for the Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5, you're going to need a solution to the excessive amounts of heat it produces, whether that be throttling, an advanced cooling system, or in the case of the reference device, a phone that is specifically designed to handle the processor's power and do nothing else. What does this all mean for you, the person who is going to buy one of these phones? Will the phone melt in your hands while you doom scroll Instagram? No, of course it won't. These benchmarks are intentionally pushing the processor to its very limits, which 99% of people will never ever do during real-world usage. For your day-to-day tasks, the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 is going to be smooth as butter and run at completely reasonable temperatures. Even if you decide to do some graphics-intensive mobile gaming, things will still be terrific. However, this all proves two things that don't look great for Qualcomm. The first is that Qualcomm's claims of what the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 is capable of doing are essentially impossible to sustain. Sure, it might be able to hit Qualcomm's claimed performance numbers, but it can't hold on to them for very long without some sort of advanced cooling system to keep the phone from turning into a furnace. This makes Qualcomm's claims of being the fastest mobile chip a little shaky, because if you can't actually see those numbers on your real phone, do they really matter? The second big problem for Qualcomm here is that the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 clearly does get really hot under demanding loads. That means if you are doing something that requires a ton of juice from the processor, like console emulation or very long gaming sessions with graphics-heavy titles, the phone will get hot. Possibly hot enough that you can't hold it comfortably anymore, and in very, very intense scenarios, possibly shut itself down to prevent overheating, as we saw with the OnePlus 15. We reached out to Qualcomm to ask about all this, and this is the statement we received. You can read the whole thing for yourself, but the most important bit is this part here. We have seen no evidence that the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 processor is contributing to thermal issues in these review units. So that's all what's happening right now, but what does this mean going forward? Well, last year with the original Snapdragon 8 Elite, we saw problems with early phones overheating, with the realme GT7 Pro being a big one. However, we eventually saw this rectified through software updates. Once Realme realized it was pushing things way too hard, it fixed things up. Of course, to do that, it throttled performance a bit, but it found a happy medium between getting an uptick in performance and keeping the phone's thermals reasonable. It is highly likely that OnePlus, Nubia, and Realme, again, will do this for the Elite Gen 5. To its credit, when we reached out to OnePlus with this overheating problem, it said it is, quote, refining the thermal curve so that our peak performance remains uncompromised while surface temperatures stay comfortable. So this overheating issue probably won't be an ongoing thing. We'll see a few software updates and it will be gone. Of course, we'll also see more performance throttling, bringing all three phones even further away from Qualcomm's claims. But that brings up another question. What will happen with the Galaxy S26 series? We're still months away from the launch of those phones, but so far all signs point to nothing drastically changing about the phone's designs. That means no new cooling solutions, no bigger vapor chambers, nothing that will help dissipate the heat the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 produces. So my big concern right now is how will Samsung manage all this without throttling the chipset down too much? Remember that it will almost certainly add the For Galaxy branding to the Snapdragon chip, and will try to make it even more performant than competitors. And don't forget that Samsung has a bad history with things getting hot. Whether it's the Galaxy Note 7 exploding or the Galaxy Ring having a lot of problems, Samsung doesn't want to mess with its reputation when it comes to products getting too hot. But the big thing on my mind is what this all means for the Android smartphone industry as a whole. How much can Qualcomm keep pushing performance up when we're facing all these heating issues? Last year, it had a minor scare with the Realme GT7 Pro, but this year appears to be a bigger problem. I'm sure Qualcomm and its partners will figure this year out and we'll see everything right itself in time. But what's going to happen next year and the year after that? If Qualcomm plans to continue pushing performance up by 20% every generation, the laws of physics are eventually going to become too much to handle. What happens then? Do all flagship Android phones come with liquid cooling? Does the form factor of phones change to accommodate Qualcomm's push to make numbers go up? There's also the competition. The MediaTek Dimensity 9500 is a terrific chip. It benchmarks very, very closely to the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5. It doesn't have the overheating problem, at least none that we've seen yet, and it is cheaper for manufacturers to use. What is Qualcomm going to do about that? Is there a future in which MediaTek fully takes the lead when it comes to high-end chips with reliable, real-world performance in phones that don't cost a bajillion dollars? I don't know, but these charts sure make it look like Qualcomm is not in the position it was 5 years ago, where it was basically untouchable by anyone outside of Apple. So yeah, a lot to unpack here. But let me know what you think. Do these thermal issues concern you at all? Are you confident that Qualcomm will remain the top dog in Android? Or is their status as the king no longer assured? Are you planning on buying a phone with the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. See you all later.